Babies make lots of adorable sounds, but can sounds like this, or like this, help improve early detection of autism? The answer is yes, and today we will review how by learning that early detection of autism is important for starting early intervention, that baby sounds tell us something about their autism risk, and that machine learning can predict autism diagnosis from baby sounds in a way that could be useful in the clinic. Autism is a highly heritable neurodevelopmental condition that affects about 1 in 54 children. It's important to note that there is no blood test and no brain scan that can diagnose autism. Autism is diagnosed entirely by behavior. Those behaviors include differences in social communication and restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. Today, we're most interested in these behaviors: back and forth interaction and nonverbal communication, which includes things like making eye contact, using gestures, and the tone of someone's voice. These kinds of behaviors could be present in baby sounds. For example, whether a baby looks at someone else while they make sounds. And so they could be useful for early detection. Early detection is important because we need to know that a baby is showing signs of the condition to start early intervention. We know that earlier equals better when it comes to intervention for autism. Starting earlier means children can receive more intervention over the course of their life and get that intervention while their brains are most plastic and able to learn. Research shows that starting intervention earlier is associated with better long-term outcomes, including the need for less support in elementary school. Currently, the average age of diagnosis of autism in the United States is 51 months, or about 4.5 years old. That's in contrast to the age clinicians feel they can diagnose children with autism, which is about 24 months or 2 years old. But we could look even earlier for information in baby sounds during these first 2 years. These baby sounds are surprisingly complex. There's a lot of information buried in these sounds, like how often children are making these sounds, the pitch at which they make these sounds, or whether they direct their sounds towards someone else when they make them. These sounds could be like a crystal ball. Children are trying to communicate something in the moment when they make sounds. This kid is probably saying, "I don't like cake and I don't like the beach." But he also might be telling us something about whether he could later be diagnosed with autism. One line of research shows that as early as 6 to 12 months old, babies later diagnosed with autism cry at a higher pitch and with shorter pauses between their wails than babies who aren't later diagnosed. So if babies' sounds could be predictive at 6 to 12 months old, we could potentially leverage that information to close this gap and make diagnoses almost a year earlier. But how do we know which babies to study in this age range when they're still too young to be diagnosed with current methods? One way to do that is to study younger siblings of children who are already diagnosed with autism. While only 1 in 54 children get an autism diagnosis, 1 in 5 of these younger siblings will get a diagnosis themselves. We can study these high-risk siblings and compare their development to low-risk babies who don't have an older sibling with autism. So we've done that, looking at 266 babies. We look at video recordings of interactions with a clinician from 6 and 12 months of age. At 24 months old, these children were evaluated by expert clinicians, so we know if they got an autism diagnosis or not. One of the behaviors we're really interested in is, when babies make sounds, do they direct their sounds towards someone else? We can see this in videos of babies. For example, in this video, you can see that this girl is clearly looking at her mom while she's making sounds. And in this video, you can see that she's looking at her mom's pizza at the bottom of the screen instead of her mom.
Blah, blah, blah. I know you want my pizza.
So we can study this behavior by looking at these videos and coding whether infants are socially directing their sounds or not. Then we can compare between infants who do and do not get an autism diagnosis. When we do that, we see that the infants later diagnosed with autism, shown in the left in pink, make fewer sounds that are directed towards someone else per minute as compared to infants at high risk for autism who don't later get a diagnosis in green and low risk infants in blue. And this difference is statistically significant. So at the group level, we see differences in these autism behaviors in infants later diagnosed with autism by 1 year of age. But can that tell us about a particular baby? If we want to know if this kid is going to get an autism diagnosis, that information alone isn't enough. To answer that question, we use machine learning. Machine learning is the kind of technology that Netflix uses to tell me that because I watched Gilmore Girls, I might like New Girl or Dawson's Creek. The way we use it is by giving information about a set of babies to a computer so it can learn how to predict which ones get an autism diagnosis. We tell the computer that the babies in green don't get an autism diagnosis and the babies in pink do. And we also give it information like standardized scores on an early developmental test and information about how often they make socially directed sounds. The computer takes this information and learns a set of rules called an algorithm that it thinks can tell the difference between babies later diagnosed and those who are not. Then comes the real test. We show the computer a brand new baby and don't tell it that baby's diagnosis. We just give it the information. And then the computer makes its guess. It thinks this baby ultimately gets an autism diagnosis, and he does, so it's right. Then we do a process called cross-validation, where we rotate which babies the computer learns from and which ones it makes its guesses about, until it gets to make a guess about every baby. We keep track of how often it makes the right guess, which allows us to calculate an accuracy score. So we did this with 116 babies at high risk of autism, 28 of which, in the pink, ultimately get an autism diagnosis. We gave the computer information about their socially directed sounds and standardized developmental test scores. So the computer makes its guess for every baby, and then we get to check whether it's right. The babies in the boxes are the ones that got wrong. That adds up to 83% accuracy. That's really good, especially considering that when we just use the standardized developmental test scores without the baby sound data, it's only 73% accurate. So this is a really strong proof of concept that tells us that baby sounds can be used to predict individual autism diagnosis outcomes. The next step in this work is to leverage the full complexity of baby sounds, adding information like the pitch of cry or the rate of babbling to refine this tool so that it can be used in clinics. In summary, the next time you find yourself next to a crying baby on an airplane, instead of getting annoyed, you could think, these sounds tell us something about autism risk. Machine learning can use these baby sounds to make accurate predictions about later diagnosis. This earlier detection could allow for earlier intervention, allowing more babies to reach their best outcomes later in life.